All right, welcome back. This is segment 3 of a class that was going to take place on October 5th. And we're now starting with the material that's actually assigned for that date, starting on page 195 of our book. Page 195 are some notes and applications that we should talk about briefly. The first is the interplay between compliance policies and procedures and misleading representations. The question the authors ask here is, why did compliance fail in the Oppenheimer case? And there's lots of theories for why this happens, right? And it's a question we can ask ourselves anytime a case like this is brought. First, one possibility is the timing of the compliance review in relation to the misconduct, right? It's very possible that the firm was not reviewing compliance in a timely fashion. Another possibility is the depth of the compliance review. Even if there was a compliance review by this firm, frankly, it wasn't in great depth. That's another possibility. And finally, we can look at the ability of the advisory personnel to circumvent the review procedures. So as you can imagine, when there's a will, there's a way. And if individuals at the firm want to circumvent the compliance procedures, maybe they can do that. So it's an interesting question, because anytime there is a failure of compliance and a major SEC case like this one, we might ask ourselves, well, what happened? The firm is required to have policies and procedures in place to ensure compliance, but yet there were a series of pretty gross missteps. And so it's always important to go back and debrief and try to understand what happened. And here the authors are giving some possibilities. Second note is about hedge fund disclosure. Just very briefly, we've discussed this already. Disclosures by hedge funds and hedge fund advisors got much better after the Dodd-Frank Act because the Dodd-Frank Act eliminated the fewer than 15 exemption, and hedge fund advisors had to begin to register with the SEC. And in that case, as you can imagine, disclosures got much better by those advisors and therefore by the hedge funds themselves. Third note is about the role of broker-dealer requirements. So this is interesting. This note is about brokerage and who ultimately is considered a broker-dealer and therefore required to register as a broker-dealer with the SEC. It's a very, very significant question. When is it that somebody crosses the line into becoming a broker-dealer and therefore required to register? In the Ranieri matter, an investment advisor to several hedge funds engaged a consultant to market investments in the fund, right? Engaged a consultant to market investments in the fund. The note tells us that the broker-dealer here effectively crossed the line from merely providing information to actively soliciting investors, right? Consultants can go out and help find investors without necessarily soliciting them, but once the broker-dealer solicits investors, as opposed to just finding investors and presenting a list to somebody else, if they go out and actively solicit them, then that firm looks much more like a broker-dealer. Moreover, and this is probably the most significant aspect of this discussion of who is considered a broker, the acid test for whether somebody is considered a broker-dealer is whether the firm receives transaction-based compensation. Does the firm receive transaction-based compensation? A commission is a standard example of transaction-based compensation. Every time there's a transaction, there is compensation to the broker. This is a very important note, right? Because it helps explain when someone is considered a broker-dealer and therefore subject to the broker-dealer requirements under the Exchange Act and under FINRA rules, right? Something we haven't talked a lot about. We'll probably talk more about it, but it's very important to understand when it is that a firm will be considered a broker-dealer and therefore subject to the full panoply of rules that apply to broker-dealers by both the SEC and FINRA. Okay, the Hennessy Group, LLC on 196. So sometimes advisors are retained to just evaluate private funds and their advisors, right? Very often, clients will say, we just need somebody to come in and help us evaluate which private funds we should be investing in, right? And take a look at their investment advisors to see if they're appropriate for investment. That's the background to the Hennessy Group case. Right? That's what the background to the case on page 196 of our book. So what happened here? The Bayou Hedge Fund. The Bayou Hedge Fund was founded by three people, Israel, Marino, and Marquez, in 1996. And Israel and Marquez were the portfolio managers for the Bayou Hedge Fund. And Marino was the chief financial officer and the chief operating officer, the CFO and the COO. Bayou's purported investment strategy was nothing other than day trading, right? That's what it did. That's how it was going to make its money. By 1997, the hedge fund was in fact losing money, and the founders began to defraud investors on a pretty massive scale, right? So it fired its independent auditor, it fabricated financial statements, all sorts of problems at Bayou, and the scheme essentially unraveled in 2005, which is why we see this case. Okay, so the Hennessy Group, we're not talking about Bayou now, we're talking about the Hennessy Group. That is an investment advisor founded in 1997. It is effectively a hedge fund consultant that provides advisory services. It goes out and checks up on hedge funds. Hennessy recommends hedge funds for client investment and then monitors those investments to make sure they're doing a good job, that they're doing okay. In 2005, it had about 100 clients and $1.35 billion of assets under management. Charles Gradante ran the Hennessy Group and effectively supervised the due diligence over the Bayou hedge funds, which again, Gradante and Hennessy was recommending out to its various clients. Turns out, we know Bayou was a big mistake, it was a big fraud, but Gradante presumably did not know that at the time. He's the one who ran the due diligence over the Bayou funds and was recommending Bayou to clients. So from 2002 to 2005, Hennessy Group promoted its so-called 5-level process for evaluating and selecting hedge funds. Right? It had this great process, it said, for evaluating hedge funds to recommend to clients. Gradante made a series of representations about the quality and the rigor of its due diligence, right? How good of a job did it do in checking up on these underlying hedge funds? In 2002, Hennessy Group first looked at Bayou as a possible investment, but with regard to Bayou, Hennessy did not perform certain key aspects of its promised due diligence. It did not perform portfolio trading analysis. It did not verify Bayou's relationship with its purported independent auditor, right? You've got to have an independent auditor, and Bayou apparently had a relationship with its auditor, and it was not necessarily independent. And Hennessy failed to investigate the claim that Marino, the CFO of Bayou, was in fact affiliated with Richmond Fairfield, the supposed independent auditor of Bayou's books. So these failures made previous statements misleading and constituted a breach of fiduciary duty, right? Because why? As we said earlier, from 2002 to 2005, Hennessy Group promoted this 5-level process and made a series of representations about how rigorous their due diligence was with respect to the hedge funds they were recommending, but yet we see these ongoing problems. So the failures here made the previous statements misleading and constituted a breach of fiduciary duty. From 2003 to 2005, 40 Hennessy clients invested over $56 million in the Bayou funds, right? The Bayou fund that we know was a big fraud. But it turns out that they lost their money, right? Bayou was a fraud, and these 40 clients, most of them lost all of their money, or most of their money. And at the end of the day, Hennessy and Gradante, right, not the Bayou underlying hedge fund that we know is a fraud, but Hennessy, which is recommending hedge funds to clients, Hennessy and its guy Gradante had a fiduciary duty to clients not to misrepresent the services that they're providing and to disclose all material departures from the representations that they made. And here there were departures, right? Because they made all these statements about the due diligence they would do, and then in fact, there were 2 or 3 items which were very significant that they did not do. So as a result of those 3 items, which I mentioned a minute ago, Hennessy and Gradante breached their fiduciary duty to their advisory clients, which was a violation of Section 2062 of the Advisors Act that we're very familiar with from the capital gains case and other cases. So yet another example of a case brought against an investment manager, but a different kind of investment manager, right? Here, it's not the hedge fund and the hedge fund advisor. Rather, it's a different kind of advisor who's merely in the business of making recommendations of various hedge funds to hedge fund investors. So that brings us to the end of that case. When we pick up with the next segment, we're going to talk briefly about the notes and applications, introduce conflicts in private funds, and then I think we're going to stop before the Blackstreet case because that's a case that I think we would be much better off discussing in class. See you on the final segment.